the two outsiders, and the third one came the next day and told us we had to march, and march we did. We weren't expected to go to Batavia, from what I understand. By this stage, people were falling down with, dropping out with dysentery and malaria and things of that nature. It was contracted whilst waiting for the Japanese to come. And eventually the halt was called. I think we would have done about 10 kilometers, if that, 10 miles I should say. Then we were ordered to march again to a railhead, and there we were put into trucks. Being an officer, and I went with the officers, but I was the junior officer, so I didn't get much consideration amongst the senior officers. I got all the duties to do, but we then entrained for Batavia, and I found en route that some of the sappers had blown the bridges en route, so I was hoping the train driver knew they were already out. We came across one during transit to find that we had to get out of the trucks and carriages and so forth, and climb down into a ravine and back up again on the other side where there's more transport waiting for us for the rest of the journey. We ended up in Batavia at Boy-Glodok, which was a civilian prison, and spent a certain amount of time sort of readjusting ourselves. It was there that I personally fell ill, and I had dengue fever, and I lost all contact with reality. And but we did transfer from Boy-Glodok to Tanjung Priok, which was a school. We were the first ones in the school. Can you stop it for a moment?
Maybe you could tell us how long you were at Tanjung Priok and the time that you were there till you were moved across to Singapore. And as I understand it, you don't remember the name of the vessel you went to Singapore on.
No. Well, start from there. You ready?
Yes.
I was in Tanjung Priok for about, I would say around about 2 weeks. And as I said previously, that I had dengue fever, and I lost all count of time, space, and all the rest of it. Unbeknownst to me, I don't know how I ever got to Changi in Singapore. I must have been helped, or must have gone with the sick or something, but I have no recollection of anything, or the ship or anything that I travelled on. I end up in Roberts Barracks. Which was a hospital. Which was a hospital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wasn't conscious of any doctors being there, but a lot of male, we call them male nurses, or whatever we like to call them. They just attended to me. The main thing was that I had dysentery and I had the dengue fever. So I was administered. I seemed to not be in the hospital more than a few days because I was able to walk around the camp, and that was one of the most marvelous things I've ever experienced, because in Java we had the Japanese in the camp, and they were always bowing and saluting and things of this nature to the Japanese, and getting to Changi, and it was like moving from a dust house into a 5-star luxury hotel, because people the only guards were the Indians, and they were virtually rarely seen in the camp. But everything seemed to be a normal activity. I wouldn't say I was there too long. It was here that my regiment, the 21st Light Attack Unit, moved out, and I had no idea where they went to, but apparently they turned up on the Burma Railroad. Subsequently, days later, I was past fit to travel with the Japanese, and I went with a batch of people to load onto a ship, whose name I didn't know at the time. All I could see was it was Maru. The rest of the name was blacked out. So I had no knowledge until later as to what ship I actually travelled on. But it was a hell ship, there was no doubt about it. There must have been about 500 people, 500 servicemen of different ranks, different nationalities and so forth that I travelled with, none of which I know, so I was a loner. I had, earlier in the piece, relinquished my commission. I'd taken my pips off and reverted back to my bombardier days. Nobody would know. Reason being that I understood that the officers were to be taken by the Japanese and to glean information from us. So all ranks and badges and things like that were destroyed. So I went to Japan as a non-commissioned officer.
Now, the vessel which do you remember the name of it now?
Totuku.
Mm-hmm. And how long did the voyage to Japan take, and which port did you arrive at in Japan?
I have no idea of the time, but it would probably be about three or 4 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
The first port of call was Formosa.
Mm-hmm.
Things after that got a little bit better. The weather was greatly improved. The conditions on the ship were the most horrifying of the whole prisoner of war days. We were battened below deck. There were 4 floors. 4 floors were about 4 foot in height, so you could hardly stand up. And the ship was filthy, smelly, bounded in rats and cockroaches and things of that nature. People were sick, people with dysentery, and all they had was tubs to use. These occasionally in the rough seas fell over and tipped over. So with all the fatal metal and the rest around the place, it was a horrible trip, there's no doubt about that. I understand after the war that the captain and the sergeant major was in charge, Japanese sergeant major was in charge, were prosecuted, but attempt to prosecute, do something about it, but in actual fact failed, as I can mention later, for a reason I'll mention later.
Now, did you arrive, I'm going to suggest, did you arrive at Moji? Was that the port you arrived at in Japan?
That was the last port I arrived in.
Did you, after you left Formosa, did you go straight to Japan, or did you go into...
Went straight to Moji.
Yep, thank you.
On Honshu Island.
Mm. And about what date did you arrive there? Was it toward the end of 1942 or?
About the end of December 42.
Okay, and what was the weather conditions like
cold.
When you arrived?
Cold.
Mm-hmm.
But funnily enough, another place where I had no recollection, because I went down with malaria and the reoccurrence of the dengue fever or something like that. And I have no idea how I got from Moji to Hakodate. which of course is sort of, I think I have recollection in the back of my mind that we were on a train. Beyond that I have no knowledge. The next thing we ended up in Hakodate in Hokkaido, the Northern Island.
And would that have been, as far as you know, the most northern POW camp on the islands of Japan?
The most northern one was Bibai.
Was it?
As far as I can recall. There were about, subsequently there were about 3 or 4 other prison camps started, but that was when the war took place with the fighting took place with the Americans.
Yes.
American prisoners were brought into camps on the Northern Island.
Yep.
But we had no association with that.
Now I think you've told me that at some stage you caught up with Dr. A.G. Bristow, who had been captured out in the Rabaul area. When did you have first contact with him?
I met him for the first time in the prison camp.
Which camp?
In Hakodate.
Yes, yeah.
He was the, we had a Japanese doctor who was in charge of the camp initially. Dr. Bristow, I found out later, was our one and only doctor that we had. I spent a fair amount of time with him subsequently as time passed, because I too was in the hospital part, and eventually I developed bronchial asthma and spent a lot of time back in the camp.
And what work were the Japanese forcing you to do in that camp?
When we initially arrived in Hakodate, we were working in the dockyards, carrying bags of rice, and eventually we were told to use what they call pay skis. This is a yoke and 2 baskets on the other side, like the coolies use. That was a nightmare, because we had never walked the planks. We didn't have the strength or coordination to walk on planks and this sort of thing, loading ships with coal. Other jobs in the dockyards, mainly was in the engineering offices, engineering departments, carting and doing the menial tasks that were required of us. It was only in the latter years of being in Hakodate that we were transferred to Bibai, and then we worked in the coal mine.
All right, now just tell us please, what sort of accommodation did they have you in, and what sort of clothing did you have, and what was the food like?
The food didn't change much from meagre allotment of rice, butter, half a cup to a cup full of rice. Sometimes we had watery stew, vegetable stew of doubtful character. The rice we had was initially white rice, which wasn't good for our very people. And we asked for the raw rice, and we got the green rice, and we got the stuff that was the sweepings, I think, from the warehouse, because it was full of rat droppings and all the rest of it, and had to be sipped out. The accommodation was, as most of the buildings on the island were timber. Usually, the first camp we had was an old school, and it wasn't too bad. The floors were contained with mattresses made out of rice, quite reasonably comfortable, and it changed from concrete that we used to sleeping on.